Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 825th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege today of being your MC for a conversation featuring A.K. Burns and Ksenia M. Soboleva. We're thrilled to welcome poet Tess Brown-Lavoie here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. A.K. Burns is an interdisciplinary artist and associate professor in the Department of Art at Hunter College. Working at the nexus of language and materiality, Burns troubles systems that assign value and explores their sociopolitical embodiment. She has exhibited internationally and is a 2023 Berlin Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin and a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow. New York-based writer and art historian Ksenia M. Soboleva specializes in queer art and culture. She holds a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts NYU. Her writings have appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, Bomb Magazine, Hyperallergic Art Agenda, and various exhibition catalogs. She's currently the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Gender and LGBTQ+ History at the New York Historical Society. And we are so thrilled to have you both on the NSE today, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to you, Ksenia.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, and thank you to everyone at the Brooklyn Rail for making this possible. It's always a pleasure. And thank you to AK for joining me today. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you, to continue a conversation with you. And Eleanor, you can just you can start the slideshow just so we have something to look at. So AK, congrats on your exhibition at the Wexner titled Of Space We Are. And this is actually the first time that your tetralogy, I don't think I've ever used that word before, that your tetralogy negative space, which consists of 4 video installations, is presented in its entirety. So to start, there is a smeary spot, and each video installation sort of investigates one concept or system. So there's a smeary spot from 2015 that focuses on the void, and then there is living room from 2017 that investigates the body. Then there is Leave No Trace from 2019, and we can move through these. That is focused on land, and is the first time that this work is shown in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. And then lastly, there is your most recent video installation, What is Perverse is Liquid, which was newly commissioned by the Wexner and completed in 2023, and it investigates water. And the sort of overarching premise of your video work, not to simplify it, but has to do with, as the press release says, queer world building. And I have noticed this year, doing a lot of visiting crits and talking to young artists, that everybody's really invested in this idea of world building. And it makes sense, of course, as the planet is crumbling, the world is crumbling, but you're someone who has been invested in that exploration for quite some time. But you do so not through a digital, futuristic, cyborg, Donna Haraway angle or aesthetic. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but even though your work does engage with the genre of sci-fi, but you're working with something that very much already exists, that is already there, right? So in your work, the environment, whether it's the desert or the new museum building, the environment is the protagonist. And then your performers embody these concepts. And actually, even the way that you choose your performers, your casting, and you call the performers your acting agents rather than characters. But the way that you choose your performers is in a way an existing entity as well, because they're all people that you already know. They're people from your community. You're not newly casting these actors. And I'll stop talking in a minute, but I want to say that what I find interesting to think about in terms of your video installation is to think about the video installation as collage, because you're working with existing materials and restructuring it into different formations, with also additionally this commitment to the discarded, or that what would be considered useless by others, wastelands, trash, and instead taking that as a starting point for building a world, for world building. And I would argue that collage is actually the earliest form of queer world building in visual art. And I'm not just thinking of someone like Hannah Höch from the early 20th century, but going back further, somebody like Georgina Berkeley from the 19th century, which if you're not familiar with her, everybody should look up this artist, Georgina Berkeley. And I would almost say that the idea of world building, the way that it has manifested itself in visual art, is inherently queer in itself. So queer world building is almost like a pleonasm. And of course, it's very trendy to attach queer to anything these days. But I think that imagining and enacting a different world out of the existing pieces is a very queer gesture. And of course, I'm talking about queerness beyond sexual identity here. I'm talking about a critique of existing power structures, right? And dismantling those, and those power structures just happen to usually be heteronormative, right? And this is where I will stop, is that what is so exciting to think about when thinking about your video installation as collage is that the show, and Eleanor, you can go to the further slides here, that the show not only shows negative space, the 4 video installations, but it also actually exhibits a series of collages that you did, as well as a series of sculptures and these glass pieces. So, and I know that you think of yourself as primarily a sculptor. So I want to talk about all of that.
Okay.
But first, I'd love to, I wanted to ask you if you could just briefly speak about your concept of negative space. And I know that you've done that a lot. And for anyone who's interested and is craving more after this, there is a whole talk on YouTube of AK talking about negative space. But if you could just say a few words about negative space and your idea of it, just because I think it's a good introduction into your work and this exhibition in particular. And then I'd love to hear, how this exhibition came to be and how you decided to exhibit the 4 video installations alongside the collages and sculptures.
All right. Thank you, Ksenia and the Brooklyn Rail for inviting me here today. Okay, that was a vast, I'm not even sure, question intro. Thank you for all of that. So I guess we'll start with just what is negative space as a concept for me. So the 4 works are housed under a larger title, negative space, and then they each are titled in their own way, and explorations of these individual sort of physical systems, as you already presented. And a negative space came out of, I don't know, a lot of different things. That was my first trip to the desert and spending a lot of time in that kind of open landscape that kind of initiated the Asmiri spot, along with sort of knowing that I wanted to make a science fiction work and having a kind of interest in, dare I say, like kind of dumb puns or linguistic relationships. And I think, so negative space came to mind, I don't know, out of a lot of kind of thinking and being out in the desert, being in this open space, thinking about space as a larger premise, and the way that that gets amplified or utilized in fantasy building a lot for science fiction, like outer space is sort of this like, it's the new territory, it's the new colonial ideology in some way, right? But space is also, of course, land, and so much of that kind of tradition of science fiction is highly problematic because of all of those, what I think are like very colonizing tendencies and or fantasy and world building that's like embedded with some idea that new technologies are something we must inherently aspire to or be building towards, and that the future is this highly technological sort of space. And I think when I think about the future, I think about I think about Elon Musk on a spaceship with the other 5 billionaires. And I think about the rest of us left on Earth scrapping around for the resources that are left after they've mined everything for electric cars to make batteries. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like there's some future out there that at this point does not promise us greater living capacity through technology, I think. And I feel very critical of that narrative. So I'm kind of diverting here from the whole theme of what negative space is, but in that I like the term negative space because it implies space or outer space or all of these connotations around space. But then negative space, of course, is a term used in art and art history, to denote the everything that's kind of not the subject or the center of or the focus of a composition, right? It's kind of the inferior. What's that?
The inferior.
Well, but it's the other space, right?
Yeah.
It's the thing that we don't have a name for. It's the thing we don't talk about in the composition. And it's sort of the unnameable. And it's also, it doesn't have any particular form or shape because of that, right? And I thought that this kind of subordinated or marginalized component of a composition is also very metaphorical for what I'm thinking about in terms of an idea about having a political, like maybe forming political agency in sites and spaces that are not, that are, as you put it, kind of wastelands, right? Or seen as less valuable for various reasons, be it the garbage, be it landscapes where it's hard to inhabit as a human, be it, I don't know, abandoned infrastructures and buildings, a lot of the sites that are actually used as structuring devices in the work, basically. I think does that kind of answer the question?
No, it does. And so then where did your decision to include the sculptural and the collage elements come in, and how do those add to the negative space tetralogy?
Well, that actually came through sort of over time through conversations with Kelly Keebland, who organized the exhibition at the Wexner. Because I think originally, I knew that I was finishing up the final work in this sort of what had been like a 10-year project, and Kelly was really interested in trying to bring all 4 of the works together, and I was like super excited just to be able to get all 4 works in one place, because that's already quite a massive kind of installation project to do all 4 at once. And as we got talking about the work, and we were just sort of looking at my work over the last decade, in tandem with making video work, I make sculptures, objects, I make all kinds of things. And because I had this kind of framework for this large video work over the past decade, it actually guided a lot of the output I made that that was produced concurrently with me producing those videos. And so, and it's not quite like the Matthew Barney model, right? Where you like have your like video series with like the sculptures that are, I don't know, part of the, like, I guess they're like props or extensions of the work. What I'm actually doing is there are themes in the work. There's so many different themes in the work, and it's so expansive. I mean, to be honest, I feel like I'm not done making all the kinds of work that can come out of this concept. To be honest, I'm kind of still churning through that. The videos are done. But, you know, there's a series of fences, which are different ways that I approached ideas about borders and boundaries, which is a big theme in the work. There's these, what we're looking at here, like these, what I call disturbed mirrors, which came after I made the mirror collages. Those mirror collages are kind of a culmination of reference materials I use to build scenes within the videos. And those are a series of works that I made to, I kind of made them at the I started making them after the works were completed. So they're not sketches in that way, but they're actually, I have so many things I'm thinking about with each one, and there's so much paring down that has to happen in the collaging that I'm working in, that it was better for me to create this kind of index of imagery afterwards, once I kind of knew what was actually in the videos. And it was another way to give viewers some other kind of access into my research and the vocabulary I'm building, because it's not working with like literal narratives or things that people are used to maybe thinking about in terms of science fiction. But anyway, so I was making those collages on mirrors, and I was making them on mirrors because I was thinking about the mirror itself as the negative space in the composition of those collages, right? And I wanted there to be a negative, I wanted the surface that would be the negative space of those collages. We could go back to some of those, maybe it might help people understand what I'm talking about. Not these ones, the ones that have the imagery on them. They're, yeah, go up, 14, 12, 13, 11, 12, 13, 14, all of those. But the background, the surface of these are also mirrors, right? And I wanted to think about the negative space of the composition for these as being highly active and constantly shifting, right? As a way of creating kind of an analogy or metaphor with what I'm thinking this concept of negative space is, which is not just sort of discarded or other space, but actually this highly active and like its value is in its constant shifting, right? Or in the fact that it doesn't have a particular form. So the mirror gave me a way to activate the negative space in these collages. But then as I was working on mirrors, I got really invested in this, in just thinking about mirrors materially as something that not only reflects our environment, but is so bound up in, I don't know, I think culturally, you know, it signifies a certain kind of like the narcissism and the self-reflection and the, you know, there's all kinds of, the mirror is just also such a loaded object to begin with. And what was that?
Lacan.
Sure. Yes, there we go. And I think that I wanted to, and I was kind of interrupting the mirror by, you know, putting things on the surface of it, right? So you can't really see, you can only see slivers of things in the mirror surface in these. And I was really interested in the fact that I was kind of interrupting the function of the mirror by doing that. But I also was like, well, I'm just kind of, for this purpose, it's fine. But I was like, this thing of just sticking something on top is sort of less interesting to me than this idea of like disturbing the mirror or disrupting the mirror from within through the quality of its making. So I started doing a lot of research in how mirrors are made and working at glass foundries, which gets us to the other series of silvered works that we were just looking at, where I wanted to create like porous spaces or holes or other kinds of interruptions in it. And in that process, that's something that comes out of negative space, right? Like it has a relationship to how I was thinking in that work, but then it goes on some other sort of exploration, but it also pulls back to negative space because I'm always thinking about the quality of the process of a thing in its becoming and its making as the qualities of what it is and why it's meaningful. And there's something in sort of making a mirror from scratch and embedding it with objects that either burn out or get embedded in it. Some of these we see carbon marks in it because things have burnt out and they only left a carbon trace in the glass. And then I backed the glass with silver nitrate, which is how traditional mirrors are made. But because there's so much material disturbance within these works that make them up, they don't reflect the outside world at all. They just kind of reflect their own interiority. So that was a long-winded explanation, but it's kind of like, I don't think I would have made that work without making negative space.
Yeah.
And I see them as a kind of entangled conversation, I guess. But they're also really works unto themselves, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
it was really interesting to work with Kelly, who was open to like really bringing that, something that's not really obvious, because it's not props or it's not this thing that's like, here's a part of the video that is now a sculpture, which I think audiences might be more familiar with that version of things, but like that there's a field of exploration in a way that I think that that's getting to be exhibited all sort of together collectively as like a larger way of, okay, that's it. I think way of thinking or making.
No, I love thinking of these as references, or you mentioned an index, or even as footnotes really to the video work. And looking at this one, for example, in relation to what is perverse is liquid, there is like the peephole, and there's a leaking, and there's all these things that show up in your videos are then reflected and in these works as well. And talking about footnotes, your video work is very dense, and there are a lot of conceptual layers, right? And I almost, when I watch your films, I almost feel like somebody took a queer theory text as a script, but then instead of filming the main text, filmed the footnotes, and there's this like non-linear narrative, and I mean it's amazing, but and altogether the video work in the exhibition would add up to like 2.5 hours, right? Mm-hmm. Right around. And so I'm curious to hear what is your expectation of the viewer, because obviously somebody just walking in is not going to get all the references and all the layers, and nor do I think that you necessarily want that, but I have to admit here that I am somebody, I struggle with video in exhibition spaces, not just in terms of my attention span, but I always feel like I walked in at the wrong moment. And this says more about me as a person than about the work. But, as a Capricorn, I love having the starting time. And so the Adam Pendleton at MoMA, I had a starting time and I went at that time and I watched the full thing and it was amazing. When I don't have a starting time and I just walk in to a video piece playing, I just feel like I just get anxious. Then I'm like, oh, I came in at the wrong moment, and I feel out of sync with time. And there is, of course, a beauty in that, actually, in that disorientation. Whereas, you know, when I walk up to a painting or a sculpture, I'm like, this is the correct time for me to be viewing this. But again, I think that actually this is something that you're thinking about, and that it doesn't matter at what point you come into the piece, and especially since you are considering these as really sculptures that happen to have video playing on them. Anyway, I'm gonna stop talking. What would the ideal viewer experience be? Maybe that's the question.
Okay. I love hearing about your time anxiety. So yeah, I mean, I can't say I have an ideal. I don't think it's the project of the artist to I think I just don't even know what it would mean to like preconceive an audience, right? Like I'm going to have people who are familiar with certain things in the film and many people who are not. And I'm asking, you know, in many ways, I really just sort of want my viewer to release themselves into an experience, right? It's intentionally, all the works cycle, they're cyclical, and they, you know, it's of course, because I'm interested in thinking about time as cyclical and not as a linear, not particularly interested in narrative or linear narrative, partially because I have no idea how to do it. I'm just like not trained in that kind of cinematic thinking or storyboarding, or it's just not a way my brain works. And all of them are filmed basically in a series of vignettes, and I link the vignettes visually and orally, right? And the whole thing is driven by a visual, oral kind of, it's like I spend a lot of time in the editing studio coordinating an experience that I feel like will move you through something, right? And I use music and audio in particular really strategically to like push you through that experience, because like if someone sat there and unpacked these for like all the critical theory / art historical / blah 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 references that are layered into it, I think I would be very disappointed if the viewer was inclined to do that. I think it's fine if after you leave or on multiple viewings, if it engages you that deeply, or after you look at the collages or this room that we built as a kind of reference room, which you can see there's a series of books that I use as a sort of as references over time. There's an album that I made that was a kind of sound experiment in the process of making this work. There's also a mind map, which you don't see, which is in this room as well, that kind of, I don't know if it brings any organization to the thing, but it definitely shows you how networked my thinking is around it. So I just think it's too much to think about, and it's not that interesting to think or know all of that. I think it's very interesting to catch things and to see things be revealed. And if you watch all 4 of them, they do kind of accumulate into there's a kind of vocabulary and ideas that emerge, because there is some script, right? Like in a Smeary Spot is structured around a script of actual quotations of some theory and some sort of poetic text. There's a conversation in a bathtub between A.L. Steiner and Keon Gaskin that is, I think, revealing about a lot of contemporary politics about about how language is accumulated. And, you know, it's like there is intellectual information or other kinds of information in the work that you can sort of know the world you're within or the politics you're within. But then another part of it is very, very formal and very, you know, all of them have multi-channel, not only multi-channel video, but multi-channel sound, right? And you're like, I think, as you mentioned at the beginning, I see myself much more as a sculptor than, I'm a video artist. I'm a sculptor who makes video more than I'm a video artist who happens to make other objects or something like that. Like that's how I think of myself. And I think that the spatializing of the sound, the way it moves your attention throughout the room, the expectation that certain things are not going to keep your attention and other things are create a tremendous amount of curiosity, and having enough information to get you to move to the next thing. But, you know, as much as and I just, at the end of the day, really don't worry about people's attention spans, right? Like, you know, all of us have our 30-second attention spans, which is our TikTok video version of life. But all of us are also binging 3 hours of whatever the fuck it is at night, you know,
I don't do that.
to decompress from the day. So it's not like people don't have attention spans for an hour or half an hour of information. And especially if you remain curious with it, and if you kind of, I don't know, I think allow the kind of physicality of the experience to wash over you, right? So I'm much more interested in how the viewer's body reads this work than how their mind reads it, if that makes sense. Or I'd rather touch their body, their bodily sensorial components before the sort of intellectual components like fully reveal themselves, if that makes sense. Or like you want to get to the intellectual components because you've already been absorbed into it through kind of physical experience. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah, which is also quite queer, actually. And what is that process of thinking through that spatial experience? Do you, you know, because some of these works have been exhibited in other spaces, and then others are well, one is premiering here, and one is, I guess it's the US premiere, but do you, to what extent is each installation site specific, or, you know, do you go into the space and then think about where you're going to put the tires or where you're going to put the cube? You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's a combination, as in there are some very strict components of these works, like scale is precise, as in the cube is always the same size. The screens in a smeary spot are always the same size, no matter how big or small the room is, right? And that's because the whole system is structured around two different screen sizes. There's a 7x12 larger screen size that, like, a smeary spot is 3 screens that size, organized horizontally, for example. And I got to that size because I projected it bigger and smaller than that. And I was trying to get to a size where the viewer would feel like they were at scale with the work. It was like a human scaled projection. Because if you get bigger than that, it gets into the kind of the monumental or cinematic overwhelm, kind of like grandiosity of what large projections can do. And if you get smaller than that, you kind of feel like you're looking at a projection or at a video rather than being within it. So the 7x12 scale for me was about hitting that kind of physical relationship between the scale of a video projection and the viewer. And then the second size, like you see in this one, I have a smaller size screen here in the center of the room and then 2 bigger screens on the back. The cube is using the smaller size screen on all 4 sides of the cube. And that's a 4-foot by 7-foot screen. That came as I did the second piece, living room. I was like, I knew that one was going to be 2-channel because I was thinking about the body. I had gotten to this idea of the body being kind of bifurcated, but that the 2 sides of the body are never exactly the same. And because that one is structured around the body as the larger theme in the work. And so I was like, well, I want a different scaled. I'll have one of the large size screens, but I want a different scale for the second screen. And because I was also working with the theme of that, everything was kind of in that video, that everything is sort of hermetically sealed within this abandoned building that was, or not abandoned, sorry, it was still very much functioning as a living space for, there was an abandoned sort of floor that they used for the residency for next, it's a building next door to the new museum that they've now demolished, basically. And because I was kind of as hermetically sealing the entire video within that building and using different sites in the building as kind of analogous body parts, I structured that installation around the idea of a kind of revealing the way a site is like the way our environments are constructed, that they are highly constructed. And that can be like as much as a building as it is like, maybe I'd make that metaphor go all the way through to like language or like the things that are constructed, right? So in that I always tear off the, I remove the drywall from the room, and you have the exposed studs. You'll see it if we could go back to the living room installation. And because I was like removing drywall, I was like, oh, if I just take a sheet of drywall and lean it, so the smaller screen on the right is just a sheet of drywall that's been leaned up next to the other screen. And so that's how the 4 foot high, because that's just a standard sheet of drywall. So it's like there's different logics that get me to scale or to like building the environments. And they come through the process of filming, but then also reflecting as the film is kind of culminating on what form it's going to take. So those kind of things, like the scale of the screens is super, super specific, or the idea that there's like a gutted couch in the room. But I've remade this couch and it has variations on a theme, essentially, in different installations, because it's intentionally a piece of trash. It comes from the trash, it will go back to the trash. And it, the cost of like keeping that and shipping it is, to me, sort of more wasteful in some ways than it sort of being reactivated trash at some point. So there's also just certain ethics in like what comes into the room and what gets remade and what gets adapted for a particular environment, right? I don't know if that covered, I'd have to go through each one to really explain all of them, but does that kind of make sense?
It does. I know. I'm like thinking, we should say that for the living room, the whole, the premise was that you used the new museum building and it became a body, and the basement was the uterus and the stairwell was the intestines, and then it, when that, the things make more sense. Can we play the video, Eleanor, and we'll just talk over it just so that we can get a sense of what it's like to actually be in the space and experience these works. I find it interesting that, on the one hand, you are really steering clear of cinematic tropes like narrative and scale. But I'm wondering, what are the ways in which you feel that you are engaging with cinematic tropes? And is sound one of them?
Yeah, I mean, yes, actually, that's just, in the sense that, so I think tropes are really exciting because they come with like a lot of cultural baggage, right? We have ideas about what we think they are. Like what's a science fiction trope, and there's a lot of like woo-woo kind of spacey electronic music, maybe, certainly the desert has a whole vocabulary within science fiction. So, even me sort of like being in the desert and then knowing that I wanted to make the science fiction film, and then it clicked right away. I was like, oh, this landscape already evokes so many of those tropes, like this is the perfect place to start, right? And also in the soundtracking, there's a consciousness, self-consciousness, whatever it is, about utilizing some of that quality of sound that's kind of like eerie or spacey or other things like that. But in the same sense, I'm always very critical of what a genre and a trope is. Like the whole reason I'm making science fiction, where I did the porn work piece, Community Action Center with Steiner back in the day, all of those came out of an interest in breaking down where the edges of any particular genre or any particular trope is to begin with, right? So I like to take elements that evoke those qualities, so you know that I'm teasing out that site or that kind of cultural point or cultural language, let's say, right? But I think, like anything that has, I think that the definition of things and how we define things is sort of an ongoing kind of mutable territory, right? Like what we thought certain words meant 2 decades ago are used very differently now, or what words are popular to explain certain kinds of things, or what defines any of those things is shifting essentially. And that's also for me one of the sort of premises in negative spaces, that sort of the territories and the spaces that aren't holding clear definitions in terms of their sort of ontology or epistemology or anything, right? Like, so
yeah,
okay.
It's slippery, which I think is, this idea of the perverse is liquid, or the liquid is perverse.
What is perverse is liquid? Yeah.
What is perverse is liquid? This idea that there is a connection between a slipperiness, a fluidity, and a perverseness, a queerness, right? Like language is slippery. I have, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm good.
Well, firstly, I want to ask you about land art, because especially when looking at the first film, and then The Desert sort of returns and other films, there is, you clearly, and I know that you have an interest in Nancy Holt. What is your engagement with land art and that trope within art history?
Well, it's funny. It's like a thing that gets brought up a lot, and I think, like, it's like you go to the desert and then
You're making
wants to talk about land art, right? Like that's the trope of that within art and art history. And yeah, and then of course I have my own interests, which very specifically I'm a fan of Nancy Holt's work, and that's been made explicit in my idea talk that I did. But I think that I have a lot of problems with what the history of land art and what land art is. I mean, I think it's a lot of it is structured around excavating and asserting into a landscape. I know that it was built on a radical premise of like leaving the gallery space and somehow becoming outside of, that system. But we also know that it's, like anything in art, has been sort of easily co-opted into the canon, as it were, right? And is celebrated, and a lot of resources go into maintaining those works. And they and I think, I don't know, I see land art as just sort of this kind of, it's one of those at its moment seemingly radical premises that I think really just doesn't address what it means to engage with land and site, and especially in the United States, with the colonial inheritance that we have, and so much other stuff that goes into that. Just the sort of assumption that one sort of reinserts themselves on a site, it just is, it's something that I can't digest very well within my own politics. my interest in Nancy, you know, comes out of the fact that I think that she approaches that potential of what land art is in a really, really different way. And I think I see like in particular, the sun tunnels is something that like literally responds to the site rather than asserting itself into the site, as in, you know, she spent an entire year out there, living out there and watching the way the sun and the stars and that particular location and place and time related to the celestial orientation it has within the universe, literally, you know. And it takes something that is like so small as a single site or point on a map and a place, and builds a relationship that is incredibly expansive, I think.
Yeah.
And it's an intention to looking and building in and with a place rather than sort of on and in. That I think is a different kind of orientation that interests me. And I just think she doesn't get enough credit in that space, because I think it's maybe the only sort of valid land art. I mean, there's a lot of other valid land art that's not the big heavyweights, but you know what I mean?
Well, I think that today, those types of engagement with land would actually be termed not land art, but ecofeminism, you know, like that's what we're moving. And perhaps there is an argument to be made for Nancy Holt being an ecofeminist. I'm sure somebody has maybe done that already in some dissertation, but the other thing that I really want to talk to you about before we run out of time is really the last piece of the tetralogy. God, I just love using that term, tetralogy, because it's the one you've spoken the least about since it's the newest one. And I would love to unpack that concept of water, right, and how it closes out the series. And I've noticed recently that, or not even recently, like for a long time, and have been interested in queer artists engaging with water, you know, like think of David Hockney's Splash, or even Adam Pendleton's portrait of Jack Halberstam, right? It's filmed in the swimming pool. Zoe Leonard's El Rio, Wu-Tang's Moby Dick, or you know, that movie that came out 2-3 years ago, Shape of Water. I think did it win the Oscar? It was so queer, right? The Shape of Water, and she's with this water creature. Anyway, so why water? And how does it close out the series? Are you a swimmer?
I like to swim about. I'm not like a swimmer.
Oh, and actually also, sorry, just to close out, is that the last time you and I had a conversation was about Cherry Grove, was on a Cherry Grove panel, and we were talking about the water, right?
Swimming, yeah.
Your experience of water. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's a whole other avenue. I'm gonna leave that one.
Okay.
That talk, so that we don't get too derailed. But so there's no particular reason it's the last one in this, or the culminating one in the series. It just happens to be the one that was left that I hadn't done yet. And the way I chose which one I would do each time had to do with the resources I had access to build the work. So the first one really was generated by being out in the desert and having this cross-country trip. So that the void and the negative space being kind of the entry point just sort of made sense. Then we get into living room in the body, but that was like, you know, I was offered that exhibition at the New Museum, and then in that residency, they offer you that space. And then I was like, what am I going to do with this space? Like, how does this work even move into an interior space in this kind of way? And had to ask myself a lot of different questions about that. I'm not going to get into all of that, but, and then, you know, and so that something developed in the work that was also like this idea that like, sorry, what I was going to, let me skip forward just to that. So the third one, I got sort of the residency at MPAC, and that building is like so wild because they have a theater that's acoustically perfect. Like it has a 0 decibel theater that like floats in a building that floats inside of another building, and it's like very high tech. And there was something about absence and negation that I was still exploring through the void, and land, which was in that language of leave no trace, that I was like, I don't know, somehow that one became the land one. There's some larger explanation for that. But so it was like, just that, those, none of those spoke to me as being the ones about water. And water was always very intentionally part of this work, just because I think the four physical systems, right? The void being kind of the premise of the negative space, or maybe it's the politics of the work, and it's a kind of way of rethinking about sight and ontology and all of these things. Then we have the body, which for me is just the way different things coalesce, right? All kinds of bodies. And that is kind of part of being in the world, is that there are different kinds of bodies. Some of them are machines, some of them are human, animal, and otherwise. And
Body of water.
Bodies of water, exactly. And then land to me is just foundational to like the way we as humans exist. You can't, if you kind of have to readdress the way we deal with land as a really proprietary, territorializing. We have so many practices around monetizing and territorializing land, and defending land and boundarying land. And that is so foundational to how our personhood and politics are formed. And so if we want to readdress all of that, to me, we have to readdress land fundamentally and how we think about space. And then water for me is just the element that is, you can't sort of, it's sort of the life force in a way, right? Like humans, there's of course the interesting fact that humans and the earth have almost the same percentage of water. And I think that I also grew up in Northern California, and I had like living with drought, which is still the state. And the way California got a deluge this year, but I think a lot about that peril of feeling on the edge of a lack of water. So water was just always going to be part of the work. And then it came last, just based on these kind of series of resources and opportunities I got to build this work. And then, of course, because of the timing, it came right on top of COVID, the production of it. And I think there was something about needing to remain localized, right? Like I thought, oh, I'm going to go back to I'm going to go back to Lake Powell because it's been 10 years. And there's like, the whole watershed is like half as full as it was when I was there a decade ago. Like I could, like thinking about maybe the literalizing and documenting of that, like way that landscape is totally under duress, and I like those were other themes that might have been part of this final work. But there was something about being home and being, I moved upstate in 2018. And so, and I spent a lot of time sort of walking around my neighborhood upstate. And so there's certain sites like the Vlaie, which is that body of water that has all the trees kind of growing out of it, that's on the smaller screen. And we have these two performers kind of chirping at each other and responding to the sounds of the Vlaie and of the environment that they're in. It's this kind of call and response with the site they're in, that slowly turns into language over time, that actually is an excerpt from a Natalie Diaz poem. What was the quote? I think, do I have it here? It's, oh, unsoothable thirst is one kind of haunting. That's the quote.
Yeah.
And so instead of kind of going back to the West and or looking at these other sites I thought I was going to really structure water around, I just started looking at the environment I was in. And of course, there's a lot of water on the East Coast. Like it's actually ample. I mean, it's crazy because we're actually having a drought here right now, but in general, like my experience of being on the East Coast is having like kind of too much water, more than not enough water. And so it really changed the way this work looks. It actually has a water kind of, it's kind of copious with water rather than a lack of water. And then there's other things that are just because I structure all of them around sites that interest me as I'm building the work. I live outside of Kingston. Kingston used to be the hub of the production of IBM back in the 80s. And there's this giant abandoned IBM campus in Kingston that I was able to get access to. And so I had this like abandoned sort of office building. There's this cave in Rosendale that I became obsessed with, which was a mine used to mine the sort of cement that was used to build the Brooklyn Bridge and the Statue of Liberty. But it looks like a natural cave, but it's actually a mined environment. Like it's just the cave structure is because it's been mined to be that way. And there's a lot of sites in these works that look natural, but are sites of human extraction, actually. Mm-hmm. So it's just, there was a lot of because like you pointed out from the beginning, the sites or the environments where I'm shooting are the protagonists in the film. I build each scene after I understand and know the environments I want to respond to. It was staying local and staying kind of aware of things that were interesting to me in the place that I lived that sort of built that work, Mm-hmm. And then we get into all kinds of other themes that run through it, like the skeleton and death, and which I linked to the death card in the tarot, which is a water card, and Scorpio. Speaking of our signs, Scorpio. Will and I, actually, Will the performer is also a Scorpio, and so we have a lot of talk about even the quality of what water is as a kind of how you embody that, let's say, in
yeah, your work is quite autobiographical, actually.
Yeah, it is. I think it's like very coded in its autobiography, but it's really builds a lot on experiences over my lifetime and actually very personal responses to the world. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you one more question before we move on to audience questions, because I think if I don't ask it, somebody in the audience will. How much guidelines do you give to your performers? Do you have a very scripted idea of what they're going to do, or is there like an element of improvisation?
Maybe I'll use the last one as a way to talk about that, since
yes, let's do that.
So like I was talking about, like, so we have this acting agent in the last one, which is the skeleton. I had Will Rawls perform as a skeleton in like literally like a Halloween costume, skeleton style. Because again, I love like kind of, I always do like very like low budget special effects, or not into like fancy costuming and kind of like.
Which makes it campy too.
Yeah, so there's always a little, there's certain playful, I hope people like there's a lightness to it. There is supposed to be kind of a playfulness. Yeah. For all the intellectual seriousness in it, it is also kind of making fun of itself in different ways. Like, so for all the scenes that the skeleton is in, which was inside of this abandoned building, and I was thinking about kind of like not only like the death of the office, but also this sort of thread of water and death. and the death and renewal, you know, like all those things that are kind of built into that. And I wanted this like animated skeleton, which kind of works against the kind of inert or dead. I think there's something, skulls and skeletons actually have shown up in the other work. This is the most sort of animated moment of the skeleton. And the skull or the skeleton in the work has always kind of represented like human presence and human absence sort of simultaneously. Anyway, so in the idea of actually finally animating a skeleton and it not just sort of being a prop or an inert object in the work, Will and I spent a day walking through the building, looking at different sites in the building, talking about how would a skeleton move. Okay, the skeleton has no muscles, only has bones, or so that there might be a kind of clankiness to the movements, you know, and then Will would try out some movements and we'd talk about how that looked or what seemed right, and if it was getting too campy or if it was like the right tone. And so I know going in that there's certain things about the site that I'm interested already in. There's certain things I will discover in being there with the performer usually. And then there's other things that I'll discover about how to develop choreography or movement or what events occur that also just happens in the sort of working process of, like, usually there's a dialogue. I don't ever see I could see myself as like a soft director, you know, like I very much have an agenda and I have a framework I work in, but nothing is so scripted that it has a finite beginning and sort of end of how my expectations are. I think it's really important to be in dialogue, both with the performer and the environment, to see what emerges, which is also why I am always behind the camera and I shoot my own work as well, because I often don't even know the framing of a scene until it's happening. So for me, I sort of need to be in and with the camera. I've tried to use other camera. I always have a second camera, but like, I don't know how I would let go of the camera entirely, because something comes into focus also in like setting up the scene and shooting, learning about, you know.
And while you're working with people whose practice you already know and respect, right? So
Yeah, they're people that I'm intentionally want to be having a dialogue with, and there's usually a lot of trust there, and we're often coming from like, very rarely do I give people a ton of information about why I'm making the scene. I'm just like, okay, you're going to be the skeleton, we're going to be in this building, and so we're going to talk about that. But because sometimes I don't even fully understand what the scene is going to be, like what the meaning of it is. Like I don't even really proceed with what the end meaning is supposed to be. To me, it often also sort of reveals itself in the process of making the film. Like I have threads of information and interests that are guiding me, but there's a sort of a continuous learning process through beginning to end in the making of the work that I try to maintain that as long as possible, but sort of not knowing and curiosity in my own work that drives how I make the work, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's palpable, that the process is a critical part of the work itself. AK, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ksenia. It's been such a pleasure.
I think we're going to open it up for questions if there are any from our audience.
Yeah, thank you so much, AK and Ksenia. That was an incredible conversation. And I wish I could make it out to Ohio. It seems incredible. But
well, I can do a little promo, which is the book should arrive on the shores of the US in about 2 weeks.
Oh my God.
And we'll be having a book release at PS1 in mid-late July. So keep your ears. I don't have the exact date yet, but the book has is a very robust other way of entering into the work if you aren't able to see it.
Amazing. That's so good to know. Thank you so much.
We'll be there.
Yes, absolutely. And we do have some questions from the audience today. Our first question is from Jacqueline. I'll read it on their behalf. Jacqueline asks, is land art the trending term for earthworks of the past? How are they different?
Oh no, we need an art historian in here. Like,
That is
tackle this.
Oh my God, earth art versus land art. I don't know. I think that they are used. I think
interchangeable.
yes, I think they have been. I mean, I guess what Anna Mendieta would be earth art, and Robert
Right. And that wouldn't be really
art.
land art.
I don't know. It's been a minute since I was in grad school.
Yeah, I'll say I'm not a huge fan of categories, so I'm not one to like be very good at defining it.
But I will say that I think ecofeminism and just like eco anything is the trendy term for both land art and earth art. I don't think that we would say.
I don't think you could call most land art though ecofeminism. I think there's certain.
Not in hindsight, but like ones that are made today. If it's
Right.
not a man.
It is not by a man. Uh-oh. Now we're getting into essentializing gender. We're
Male art can be feminist.
Real wormhole.
I'm teasing. No, I don't know.
Amazing.
Did we answer that? I don't know if we did. I feel like we did.
I would say it was addressed. Yeah.
I'm just going to say it's outside of my knowledge territory, and I'm not sure how much I can contribute to that question. I have lots of opinions, but you know.
Well, feel free to share your opinions if you want.
I mean, no, but I really know they were used interchangeably, earthworks and land art, because yeah, like spiral jetty was referred to as an earthwork.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I might say that I do think that there tends to be a little bit more of a derogatory notation for land art at this point. I think that, am I overestimating in saying that? But I don't know.
Maybe earth is when you're actually engaging with the earth, like the spiral jetty, whereas land art could be when you're putting a structure into.
I also just think like earth art should be much broader than like just working with the land in that way. I don't know. I mean, I think.
Yeah.
Like, I think we could, I think we could propose that we should expand that field to being beyond these sort of sculptural interventions on a site and be thinking about what earth art is fundamentally.
There's definitely art historians working on this that will watch a recording of this conversation and be like, you morons.
Yeah, Help Street.
They're not in the audience right now, but
yeah.
They're out there.
Oh, is there anything else that I can actually illuminate?
Yeah, we do have another question. And I just wanted to shout out before that Anna's comment in the chat that says language serves us, we don't serve it. And I think maybe that kind of addresses the question as well. Thank you so much, Ksenia and AK for that. Our next question is from G.
Thank you, Eleanor, Ksenia, and AK. Thank you so very much for today's conversation. It just wonderfully constellates in so many different directions. As I'm watching and listening today, it seemed as though I get this vibe from your work that it's influenced by writers like N.K. Jemisin, Octavia Butler, and maybe even Samuel R. Delany. Even in the way they structure their books. Is there anything to this? And are there other influences from literature, fiction, nonfiction, and poetry that are coming in for you?
Yeah, definitely. On my reading table in there, I definitely have N.K. Jemisin and Octavia Butler, and I'm definitely a fan of Samuel Delany's work. you know, there's also some references to Ursula K. Le Guin, like literally there's text from that work in the script for A Smeary Spot, as well as I have the two large fence works that I call The Dispossessed. There's quotations from T.S. Eliot's Wasteland in the A Smeary Spot script. The last work that I did, What is Perverse is Liquid, has various quotations from Natalie Diaz's post-colonial poem. There's or post-colonial love poem, excuse me. Yeah, so I think there's, I don't know if I'm going to remember everything, but I think it's, you know, I don't know that I like read those works and thought to structure my work in that way to kind of be analogous to the way those writers think and work. But I think I might just say that there are, I am already prone to working in this kind of hybridized collaging, kind of piecing together of vignettes. Like it's the way I see and feel the world just sort of seems to align with that. And you know, the fact that it would align with other thinkers and makers sort of just makes sense. I think that it's a way of seeing and feeling that is a kind of articulating, you know, that happens in literature and art and other music and all kinds of forms, you know, that there's probably kinship with my work. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you so much for that question, GE. That was a great one. We do have a tradition here at the Rail of concluding our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm really thrilled to welcome Tess Brown-Lavoie to the stage. Tess Brown-Lavoie is the author of Light Year, which won the Fence Modern Poet Series. Other writing has appeared in the Denver Quarterly and Berkeley Poetry Review, among others. Tess co-founded Sidewalk Ends Farm in Providence in 2011 and has served as president of the National Young Farmers Coalition. Tess holds an MFA from Naropa University and was the 2020 to 2022 Ann Waldman Fellow. Tess currently teaches writing to architecture students at the Pratt Institute in New York, and we're thrilled to have you here to be reading for us today, Tess, and over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much to you both for the dialogue, and also to the Brooklyn Rail and Carolyn for inviting me to read. I'm gonna read two poems that I think mobilize or occupy negative space in narrative through language that resists logic, or even that resists meaning. So I'll just get into it. This one is really specifically about looking, so I thought it would be appropriate. It's called For Your Description. Third-story windows open to the river. Night extends a glance across the water. The view is respiratory, a cyclical departure and approach. Objects that survived each serial smoothing of the city hold my attention. Here the pilings jut from the imperfect surface of the water. From the steps of the institution, our smoke disperses in mimicry of memory. From a foot away, I aim spit at your mouth. I almost cut loose, but stop as we are seen by a set of strangers. Even without my projectile, we are possession's signature on non-possessive love. The gift of each other's private labor, I own her through ekphrasis. Your thought, your description, your gesture inside my form. And she would own me by killing me momentarily, while I work hard to resist my death while extracting its knowing, smoking less. In the mountains, altitude went to my head. My head was very heavy compared to lightness around it. The sun was more persistent in that other place. Night there longs for water. So I tried to map desire. The figures showed a series of lines between me and you and a third object. The lines were the foundation of a complex system of triangles. The writing was too difficult to read, and I was advised to include a vestibule in the essay to mark the architecture by which a person might enter the text. I made your description very literal. You want to approach the entrance to my body, ready like a respiratory cycle, you want to come inside. Imagine a doorway at the bottom of this page, threshold pressed to the margin. This architectural feature makes an invitation. I went closer to death since our last repetition. The folding over left me speechless. My new poem lacks description. But there was the respite of approach, relaxing once I was completely absorbed with endings, death, your description, possessed only by a concept of form, my surface cold. Entering the vestibule, unfastening my coat. My sadness is noticed at dusk. Dusk brings description of you, oh. I ran faster, sleepless, as January slipped again through the sieve of my life. Dregs of sun melted the wreckage. Resonant with all suns, our prior trespassing, our vast memory of one another, near another's other. The way a ghost describes a living person's opportunity in the difficult labor of living. My return stabilized the court, which had an uneven triangle across it. The points of the triangle moved laterally. They played the edges. They held down the constraints of the frame. Miles reverberate in the lungs and chest, miles of all the years, expirations, the final breaths. What door opened? What brought me inside? Here, so close to you, and closest to the past, delete, delete. A description of loss diffuses its texture in everything else. The view of the river, subservient night, the wreckage, your scent and arm make a territory of your possession. And the territory holds me like my delusion. It owns me like my best friend. It comforts me like you used to do, like you do in your description. Okay. And this one is about the excruciating erotics of negative space. It's called My Distance Wants Attention. My distance wants attention in the form of speech that would cut the shape around distance, like the mountains cut the form of sky. Hung sky, you want a poem today, oh. We are splayed across time again, and while you are stuttering distance, asking for my penetrative look, coax your spread, mouth first across the center of my lexicon so I can attend to the surface or line you drag off my hip, away toward where you are going, faster than usual, distance. You want to know the color of my cheek now, skin taking on the heat of summer, okay. I am red for you everywhere, and where distance has fixated her teeth in the past, dragging time into visible dimension toward me, as though distance were a painter, pressing more distance into distance hard with my exemplary tongue, as in winter, when distance stopped for a night in Bed-Stuy, sat on my lap by the speaker and fucked me in a way that kept my body in distance for days. And further, you think you are unknowable distance, but I feel on or out your material, my hands and words, my hands and mouth, the words I found for you and us, the faucet you found in my long pipe, temperature I named after you, dropped open and opening, pressed against, distance again, neck completely back. You want to know some of my tears and not others. Time is tensile, strapped on you like a mountain, demonstrates the work of hard moving land. And I am shocked you would edit the word lacustrine out of my story. And distance will never know how many times a hummingbird startled me today from this memory of crossing between a fantasy and sober truth of distance. Thanks.
That was so beautiful. Thank you so much, Tess. That was just a really lovely way to conclude today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, AK, and thank you, Ksenia. This has been so great. Thanks to all of you in the audience for tuning in today. We would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program to make these conversations possible and for supporting our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern for a conversation with Thomas J. Price and Jonathan T.D. Neal on the event of Beyond Measure at Hauser and Wirth in LA. We'll conclude tomorrow with a poetry reading by Basie Allen. And you can now all turn on your microphones to say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all again for being here today. Thank you, Ksenia. Thank you, AK. It's so great.
Thank
Yeah,
you, Ella.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Oh,
you.
hi,
That's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have an amazing Monday, everybody. And go see the show if you're in Columbus.
Go see the show.
Yes.
Show, get the book.
And order the book. Yeah, we'll see you at
Yes,
Moment 1 in July.
Bye. Yes. Can't wait
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
so much.
Happy
Take care,
Monday.
everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.